Why in the world would anybody want to pray that they intentionally have a seizure? I'm epileptic, and this is my story. I'm epileptic, somebody who has a seizure, and when you think of someone having a seizure, you think of somebody flopping all over the ground with foam coming out of her mouth. That's called a grand mal, and they are unconscious when it occurs. I've actually only had one of those types of seizures. It occurred 5 years ago, 6 years ago, something like that. 90% of large episodes happen when people are asleep, when the body's at rest. I woke up in the ambulance, woke up again at the hospital, and the very next day afterwards, my entire body, all the muscles ached so bad that I could barely walk. I had to go to the doctor. What was it? Why did it happen? And they did a bunch of different things, some of which were MRIs, where you can see that 1/4 of my brain is not even turned on. It doesn't even do what it's supposed to do. The very first time that the doctor actually reviewed the MRI, I was sitting across from them. Their eyes went wide and they said the words, "Wow, I'm surprised you can walk." To check out my brain, they actually put a bunch of different probes on your scalp, and it shows what type of activity is happening in the brain. I got put on medication, and I've been on medication since. Since then, I was having what was called auras, the doctor's term for the onset of a seizure. It's where you can tell that your body is starting to feel weird. The best way to describe these auras is as if you had two magnets facing a certain way. They try to push away from each other because there's an invisible force between the two magnets. Now imagine if these magnets were the size of two automobiles, and your brain just happens to be between the two magnets, and slowly the two magnets begin to try to press against each other, and the closer they get to each other, the more your brain feels the pressure, the more your brain begins to become uneasy. Even though I had not had any more seizures, I was having auras. Now you fast forward to today. I've relocated to a different city. I've had to have all of my information from the previous doctor passed to a new doctor. That doctor says that my case is too extreme for them, so they passed me to another doctor that's in a larger city, which means anytime that I need to see a neurologist, I have to travel. This doctor, despite having the information from the electrodes, the MRI, and my medication history, wants to redo all of those tests. And we do it. The electrodes attached to my brain for an entire week while I'm at home, but they don't see anything. They don't find any information. So they decide they want to do the same thing. But when they do, they want to take me off of the medication cold turkey. And they're going to add stimulants that would cause a seizure to occur. For example, a strobe light. Now this is all in the middle of COVID. I scheduled my appointment to be in the hospital in a bed with all these electrodes on my head for an entire week, 3 months in advance. I happen to work for a union. With this particular union, there's a point system for your ability to get terminated from the job. And the point system is based on attendance. And once you get up to a total of 6 points, you don't work there anymore. So if I'm going to this doctor's visit and I'm going to be there for an entire week, I'm done. That's 6 points. Well, the company that I work for actually has a sister company that handles the medical side, where you can take off for short-term disability or long-term disability without receiving points. They don't want to help me, which means that I'm going to point out. But going into the hospital and taking this test and establishing my health is more important than this job. And I tell my boss I'm going to be off this entire week because I've had this thing scheduled for forever. 2 days before I'm supposed to actually go to the hospital notifies me that in order for me to go into the hospital, I have to show on paper that I do not have COVID. So I have to go get a COVID test, and they have to fax that information to my neurologist, and I fail the test. So that's it. I'm not going to the doctor. I've been waiting 3 months, and I've already told my boss that I'm going to be off for the week. I turned the paperwork into my boss because if you have COVID, you have to be quarantined for 2 weeks. So I faxed the paperwork not to the doctor, but to my boss. You're quarantined for 2 weeks, but you also happen to get paid for the 2 weeks that you're in quarantine. So the very next day, I'm just contemplating the entire situation. I'm already going to have to be in quarantine for 2 weeks on paid leave, despite the fact that the company I was trying to go through for short-term disability, which would have done the same thing, failed and didn't come through. The next day, I spend a little bit of time in prayer first thing in the morning, and I tell myself, you know what? My God is a God that can make a way. And if God wants me to go and take this test, He will make a way. So I schedule another COVID test at a different location. And I show up at that building for that test almost an hour early. And I sit in my car and I spend that entire hour in prayer. Not saying, God, make me pass this test, but saying, God, if you want the door to open, you're going to make it reopen. And if it doesn't reopen, I will not be mad at you, and I will love you, and I will be thankful for everything that you've provided me, irregardless of my disability. I go in, take the test, and it shows negative. I do not have COVID. I immediately tell them, you need to fax this to my neurologist. God answered a prayer, but He not only answered a prayer that was making me be able to go into the hospital, He was answering a prayer that allowed me to be off for not just the 1 week that I needed to go in and take the test, but for 2 weeks. 1 week to be cold turkey off of my medication to be in the hospital, and 1 week for a recovery process because I'd have to get reacclimated into my medication before I went to work. And every bit of this time off would be paid, despite the fact that the sister company was supposed to assist me with short-term disability. God is amazing. And that's just the first prayer that He answered. I get to the hospital, cold turkey, I'm off my medication. Now, you need to understand, because of these auras, I'm missing out on basic portions of life that people get to enjoy and take for granted, like watching cartoons with their children, like going to the bowling alley where there's loud noises and flashing lights and TV screens right above your head while you're trying to bowl. But I can't. I went to a museum one time, and part of the exhibit was in 3D. I didn't get to see that portion of the exhibit, and my wife is an artist. My wife is an art curator. Art is important to my wife. I didn't get to enjoy art with my wife. I'm missing out on portions of life, so it's a big deal. It's important for me to be there to figure out what's going on. And God answered that first prayer. And on day 1, I haven't been on my medication for an entire day. Nothing happens. Same thing happens day 2. I'm so fed up with the fact that nothing has happened that I'm doing things that would on a daily basis cause me to have these micro seizures, which are called auras by the neurologists. One of the days, I believe on Wednesday, I sat with some music in the background and I watched a high-speed Mandelbrot set for almost an hour and a half, and still nothing happened. By Thursday, I'm starting to feel angry. God, you're the one who made a way for me to be here. Tomorrow is the day that I'm being discharged. I would watch strobe light videos at night on purpose so that I would have an event, and nothing's happening. About halfway through the day, probably 5 o'clock, I'm watching a sermon about prayer. And this guy is telling the entire story of Peter and the fact that Peter was in prison and that they were going to kill him. People are praying, an angel comes and wisps him away from the prison without the guards even noticing. Peter, therefore, was kept in prison. But prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. At the end of that segment, when he escapes, he ends up going to the house and he's knocking on the door. That was the house where many were gathered together, still praying. So even after he had escaped, while he was on his way to their house, they were still in prayer. So a thought came to me. If the church prays, God will intervene. I call a member of my church that I trusted with this sensitive information to gather up what you would call prayer warriors. It's a very generic term that I think is silly. And she did just that. I told her the story. We needed to see something happen. So we prayed over the phone that God had made a way for me to be there. And if it weren't for him, I wouldn't be there. And then with that in mind, he is the God who will answer prayer. So our prayer was that I would end up having a seizure because God had me sitting in that bed with all those probes on my head. She told me that she would get 4 or 5 other women that she trusted that would actually spend time in prayer. And the women started to pray. The doctor comes in and says, we're going to try something new. And it happens. The thing I had prayed for occurred. I had a seizure. I would say that it was the equivalent of a grand mal seizure, which is the one where you know that people's arms and legs are locked up and they're shaking violently and their heads off to the side and they're drooling. But I was wide awake and I was conscious and I watched it happen and I felt every bit of that pain. It was the most painful thing I've ever felt in my entire life. Because the electricity goes from your brain and it goes down through your entire body and it ends at the base of your appendages. My arms were pulled straight and my fingers were bent in awkward positions. I had a nurse at my feet holding my legs down and I had a nurse beside me and I was screaming out in pain. And I screamed, my hands are breaking. Just look at them. Help me! It's the most pain I've ever been in my entire life. And I don't know how long it lasted. I even remember one time I would look to the nurse to my left and said, am I dying? And when it was done and the nurses were gone, I laid there and I cried. But I didn't cry because it was painful. I wasn't crying. Why me, God? Why? Why me? I was praying, thank you for answering prayer. Thank you, God. But at the same time, I was crying because of the pain. I'm over here thinking this is the most painful thing I've ever felt in my life. And yet, Christ died for me. I don't know anything about pain. He was on trial 7 times and they beat him and spit in his face. The pain that he felt was much, much worse than what I felt. So who was I to think that I knew anything about pain? So those tears were not tears of being angry at God because I had this problem. Those tears were me understanding, finally, that I will never understand the true meaning of pain, despite what I had just gone through. The pain that Christ felt was 7-fold what I went through, because what I went through was for probably only about 8 minutes. He went through it for me and you. When I got discharged from the hospital, they put me back on my medicine. They told me, we'll see what the results look like. We'll have a phone call in a few weeks after we've had time to look at it. Well, it turns out that 1/4 of my brain doesn't even work, and yet I can still stand. Having told this story where God answered my prayer, I want you to understand that God is not a genie. God is not going to answer your prayer just because you prayed it. The modern non-denominational world, the modern evangelical world takes the scriptures on prayer out of context, and I'm going to show you the examples of what I'm talking about thinking that God is a genie, because I very well could pray, God, why am I sick? Why is 1/4 of my brain not working? Fix it. Make a miracle. Why me, God? But I don't, because I know that my God is a healing God, and that if he wanted it to be fixed, he would fix it without me even having to pray. So here is the verse that the modern churches are using for prayer, because the modern churches teach, just speak it. You got to speak it into existence. It's Mark 11:23 and 24. For verily I say unto you, that whoever shall say unto this mountain, Be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, but shall believe that those things which he says shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he says. Therefore I say unto you, what things soever you desire, then you pray, believe that ye receive them, and you shall have them. So basically, I can have whatever I want if I truly believe it. God is a genie. That is not true. This verse is taken out of context because of the very first word. The very first word is the word for, or therefore. Therefore, verily I say unto you, which means that there's context before and after this verse. Now, if we consider Mark 11:23 and 24 in its actual context, if you look at the previous verses, every single verse in chapter 11 from verse 1 to verse 22 starts with the word and, which means that verse 1 is a continuation of something that is being said in chapter 10. But when we look at context in Scripture, we can't just look at what's said before. We have to look at what is said after. So after verse 24, it goes on. It says, And when you stand praying, forgive, if ye have aught against any, that your Father also which is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father which is in heaven forgive your trespasses. Mark 11:23 through 24, which means if you pray it and if you say it, you can have it. But there's condition. If you don't forgive, God's not going to answer your prayer when you ask him to forgive. People think that you can move mountains with prayer, but you can't if you don't allow God to work through you by being the example that he has called you to be. So the question that somebody might ask is, why don't you pray that God heals you? Why don't you pray that he removes this disability? Wouldn't I like to not have this disability? Of course, I don't want to be epileptic. Of course, I want to enjoy things that I used to enjoy with my family. Of course, I'm missing out on the opportunity to be in particular scenarios with my child or my wife. This disability is a disability because it removes you from having the ability to do something. So why not pray that he removes it? If he answered your prayer twice, once so that you could go to the hospital, and once so that they could see the results. He's a God who answers prayer. Just pray that he removes that, and you'll be done, and it'll be over. Why don't you pray that? If God were a genie and he answered every person's prayer, every person would be healed. Every person would be a millionaire, and every person would be happy. And if every person is happy and wealthy and healthy, there is no need for Jesus.